Welcome to Aging Wisely, the podcast, a show that aims to center the lives and needs of the aging and disabled communities, a platform for the issues that matter to them most, a space for them, a space for those who work with and alongside them. I'm Veronica Escobar, the producer and host. My goal is to educate and transform. Today's episode features attorney Deirdre Lok, who for the last 11 years has been the general counsel and assistant director of the Weinberg Center for Elder Justice. It's located at the Hebrew Home at Riverdale. That's in the Bronx. It's the only facility of its kind in New York City. What makes it unique? They house, advocate, and provide services to older people who are survivors of abuse in the 5 boroughs of New York City and Westchester County. Elder abuse is heavy stuff and, unfortunately, more common than many of us would like to admit. Elder abuse takes a lot of forms. Some types aren't obvious, at least not in the beginning. Deirdre is a mom of 2 small children, and she considers that her first and most important identity. But beyond motherhood, she fulfills another very important role. Before starting at the Weinberg Center, she was an assistant district attorney in Queens County, New York, and also in Honolulu, Hawaii. She prosecuted domestic violence cases. When she came back to New York, she wanted to use those same skills and advocate for crime victims, but not in the criminal justice system. This led her to the Weinberg Center when it was just starting. What was the genesis of the Weinberg Center? Why does it exist in the first place?
If you think about somebody who is a victim of or has experienced domestic violence, or a person who's younger, and you envision what that would look like, you would maybe envision a woman, maybe a man. You'd envision somebody who's physically functional and cognitively intact and does not have, even if they did have any kinds of those impairments, their peer group perhaps would not reflect that of the aging population, where your world tends to get smaller. They might have family around. They might be able to go out and get a job.
And it was this part of her answer that really crystallized why the Weinberg Center is so needed.
Whereas the older adult population, and for those people in the younger population, you'd naturally think of a domestic violence shelter as being the place where they would go to if they're in need of safety and, emergency safety and needed to leave their home. For an older adult, that domestic violence shelter isn't going to necessarily provide them the level of care that they might need. If it is somebody who might have some sort of physical disability, they might have some sort of cognitive impairment, or they might have a certain level of medical need that a domestic violence shelter simply isn't going to be able to provide for. And then also a domestic violence shelter wouldn't necessarily have the holistic kind of care that we're able to provide from a social service standpoint, from a legal standpoint, that could really help the person get back into the community safely. And if that isn't a possibility, to help provide for them in the best way possible for the rest of their years.
And is that why the Weinberg Center was born? Because the existing infrastructures really weren't appropriate for older people?
Exactly. That's exactly right. It's that there was a gap in service. There was nowhere for somebody who is older to go if they needed a safe place, if their home was no longer safe because of any kind of exploitation or violence they were experiencing in their home.
Deirdre explained that the Weinberg Center is not separate from the Hebrew Home at Riverdale. The residents of the Weinberg Center live within the Hebrew Home. It is a short-term and long-term care facility like any other, and offers different levels of care for all of its residents. Are there quote-unquote typical residents of the Weinberg Center? I asked Deirdre this very question. Tell me if there isn't a typical resident at the Weinberg Center. What kind of people walk through your doors? Because I don't even know the answer to this, and I've always been curious. Where do they come from? How does somebody find you or find the Weinberg Center?
We are out there with our phone number for any professional to utilize. We take referrals from professionals, somebody who has worked with the older adult directly in the community that can be a hospital, could be somebody from NYPD. It could be, had the court call us before. Anybody can make a referral, frankly. And what happens is it goes to the admissions line, and then our admission department takes some information, and then it comes to the Weinberg Center team. And then we make direct contact with the referral source and have a lot of questions that we tend to ask, trying to understand what the abuse is, trying to understand if the person has any other kinds of supports, trying to understand if there's legal ramifications for them coming here, whether that be financially or by it being perceived that they've abandoned their home for some reason or vacated their home. So there's a lot of different pieces that we try to piece together and make sure it makes the most sense for the person to come here and that they want to come. And then once they're here, we're able to work with them directly. We really do say victims who've experienced elder abuse or people who've experienced elder abuse are not, it can affect everybody. It could affect anybody. There, it doesn't discriminate by race or culture or religion or money or any of that. And it is pretty true. We probably tend to see more women than men, but that could be a function of many things. As we know, elder abuse is dramatically underreported. So, and because, as I mentioned, somebody has to agree to come here, there is a level of acknowledgement and recognition of what they've experienced that they have to be able to understand in order to come here, unless it's a person who is cognitively impaired. And then that's a different kind of scenario. Who knows what the ebb and flow is of the different identities and makeup of the people who come in here. I would just say elder abuse doesn't discriminate.
In my practice, I see different types of elder abuse. So I asked Deirdre about her experiences, and she brought up a term that I don't hear very often, polyvictimization. What type of abuse do you think is the most common? Because if you asked me that question, the one that I see that is most prevalent is financial, probably followed by physical abuse or neglect. I have yet to see a case of sexual abuse. What have you seen, or what has been the experience of those at the Weinberg Center in terms of who do they see the most?
I'd have to agree with you, I think, and this is me speaking off the cuff. I would have to agree with you that I personally think that financial abuse is the most prevalent. The reason I say that is because of the idea of polyvictimization, where there is often one kind of abuse, you will see another kind of abuse. So for instance, I would say most of our physical assault-like cases, there's very likely financial exploitation happening too. We have, sad to say, but true to reality, seen sexual abuse cases. Appreciate being able to even say this or raise this issue, or that you raise this issue, because especially as attorneys, it's not something that you think of or that you think somebody is going to report. And sure, it's very underreported, but the statistics are out there that show that sexual abuse happens to older adults. And it's a rather ageist viewpoint to think that it doesn't in some sort of way. So it's important to realize that rape victims are over the age of 62.
Then Deirdre told me a story that disturbed me to my core. I thought I had heard it all. I hadn't. When you talk about the sexual abuse of older people, are you talking about forcible touching, molestation, or actual rape?
Both. Yes, all of that would be encompassed under the definition of sexual abuse. And in fact, even forcible watching of pornography, or forcing somebody to not wear clothing. I mean, all of these can have undertones, if not are forms of sexual abuse.
You just repulsed me with the forcing them not to wear clothes part, because I'll be perfectly honest, I never thought that there would be somebody that sick out there that would make an older person be nude on purpose.
I think a lot of the sexual abuse cases that we see, the statistics are, right, 90, if not more than 90% of abusers are family members. So when you pit that up against the statistics about sexual abuse in older adults, which indicate that there is a lot more sexual abuse than what we acknowledge or expect to see, then you can see that there's got to be some kind of overlap here. And really what we have also seen is oftentimes in those cases of sexual abuse, and it is a family member, it is less often that it's a stranger, that the person has got some form of mental illness.
So not to excuse the behavior, because I'm never going to excuse a pedophile or a rapist. If they have mental illness, then it's something that, for lack of a better word, they have a compulsion to do. Because I have a hard time wrapping my head around any sort of reasoning for abusing a family member. To me, abuse has always been about power and control of a person who's vulnerable. When I did child abuse and neglect litigation back in my baby lawyer days, it was about fear and intimidation. It was about exerting power over a person that you knew couldn't fight back, a person that if you made a threat would believe you. So how much of that is true in an older person? Because I consider older people to be equally, if not more vulnerable than children. Obviously, older people have the benefit of age and experience, and they have more of a way to fight back. But if they have diminished capacity, if they're physically disabled, if they're cognitively disabled, if they're not here legally, if they're undocumented, there are all these things that person is literally hanging over them. So can you speak to that at all? What are the similarities between child sex abuse and the sexual abuse of an older person, if you can?
I can opine on it. The part of it that I would like to highlight really is just that sexual abuse does happen to an older adult, and oftentimes when it is a family member and there might be some sort of mental illness, it may not have to do with compulsion as much as it does have to do with power and control. And the mental illness, I simply state that often is a component that I've seen. I don't know of any statistic that actually measures that. And that power and control, I think this harkens back a little bit to the comment about polyvictimization and the idea that a lot of times at the root of many of these family dynamics that involve violence is financial exploitation. And when there is, even in the event of sexual abuse in an older adult, I mean, I'm thinking about some of the cases that we have had, and ultimately it did actually come down to power and control.
Then Deirdre told me another story of a mother and daughter. As you might guess, there isn't anything happy about this story.
We had a case with a woman who had an adult daughter, and the woman was suffering from cognitive impairment. The daughter was mentally ill and would keep her mother up all night and force her in her wheelchair. The mother couldn't move on her own. She was wheelchair bound. And so the daughter would park her in front of the television and he'd blast the television all night long. She wouldn't let her mother fall asleep. She would dump cold water on her mom if her mom started to fall asleep. She withheld medications. She misappropriated the medications. If her mother was supposed to receive them throughout the day, she would withhold them and then give them to her all in one dose. And she also sexually abused her mother. In that instance, I think there was certainly, when you hear about somebody taking another person who's in a wheelchair who can't move and forcing them to sit somewhere for an extended period of time that they evidently don't want to be, that's a power move. The facts of this case came out vis-a-vis the primary care physician. And the aides the mother had were always afraid of the daughter and never spoke up. And finally, the primary care physician, when asking the daughter to leave the room for the fifth time, and she refused and threw a fit in the doctor's office, eventually got her to leave the room, and the aide disclosed to the doctor really what had been happening.
I told Deirdre that I assumed the doctor called the police then and there, but that's not what happened. And I was surprised. Even though I'm an elder law attorney, I didn't really have a full understanding of how differently elder abuse was treated, because I've never been in the position to actually report it. In my baby lawyer days, if there was any sort of a disclosure and the child was with a mandated reporter, the kid stayed with the mandated reporter until the police showed up, because you didn't want to put the child back in the abuser's possession. You didn't want to take that risk.
goes back to your point about what are the differences between a child who may have experienced abuse and an older adult who may have. The law is meant to protect children under the age of 18 until they are of age. There is no such law for older adults, and with good reason, because at what age would you pick that suddenly an older adult either doesn't have rights or can't make their own choices? The mandated reporting that exists for children, those laws and those providers, it looks very different for older adults. I think in that particular case, no, I don't think he called the police. I think he sent her to the hospital.
Which is also the thing to do, because the hospital has the authority to call the police, and they also have the authority with the person's consent to discharge them anywhere but home. I told Deirdre about a guardianship I was working on at the time, where the person was a victim of elder abuse. And they had specifically told the hospital that they didn't want to go home, and they didn't want their children to know where they were. He was discharged to a nursing home. She then told me what ultimately happened to the woman in the wheelchair.
I believe that the mother ended up going into the hospital, that a guardianship action began. I believe a guardian was appointed. We went and we advocated for what we thought was appropriate for keeping her safe while she was here at the Weinberg Center. And we faced difficult decisions in our advocacy. And I think in that instance, the difficult decision was about whether or not there could be a restraining order in place with respect to the daughter. And I say that's difficult because my instinct is to say, well, absolutely, there ought to be a restraining order. I mean, and in fact, in child abuse cases, there would be a hard stop. There's no such law for older adults. And if this mother had the ability to make the decision to see her daughter, despite what her daughter had done to her, then we don't have the authority, nor do we want it, to intervene in that relationship more than to provide as safety and support to the mother as much as we could. However, because she was not able to articulate for herself because she was incapacitated and not able to therefore make those kinds of decisions, I believe in that case, we asked for a restraining order prohibiting the daughter from seeing her mother.
Do you consider that a good ending?
No.
To be clear, though, she did say more about this. Are there ever any good endings? Because I remember in my days of child abuse and neglect, a lot of it was so bittersweet. What the children had to go through in care, what the parents had to go through jumping through hoops. I don't know how it is in your specific area of law, but I just remember that a lot of it was not uniform. It wasn't objective. A lot of it was subjective. A person could be stuck in the child welfare system for years. And when I say person, I also mean the child. And it has a way of sort of stopping your life. And I just wonder what it's like for an older person who may be going through the criminal justice system. They may be going through family court. They may be going through a guardianship themselves, what that can do to a person.
Oh, it can rip them apart, for sure. I mean, it can cause devastation and sadness and loss of independence. And it can have just a devastating effect on an older adult. In response to, is there ever a good outcome or a good, yes, there is. And the best outcomes, the outcomes that we feel happiest about, are the ones in which we're able to carry out the wishes of the older adults and at the same time ensure their safety, health, and well-being, and preserve their dignity, preserve their income, any of their assets, allow for the kind of people in their lives that they want, but most of all, where they can really get what they want. That would be a good outcome.
Where they're able to retain a bit of their autonomy and, most importantly, their dignity.
Absolutely. Those are the best. And that's what we want. And we do a lot of work around trying to understand and hear out what a person wants.
I can only imagine. I actually wanted to go rewind a little bit because you said something earlier that elder abuse doesn't discriminate. It cuts across socioeconomic lines, religion, race, and ethnicity. And you probably don't have any empirical data on this. It's probably something that you haven't looked at, but it's probably something that you may have noticed. Do you ever observe that certain communities report abuse more readily as opposed to other communities where abuse is overlooked?
Yes, absolutely. I can't speak to it in terms of the population that we see and it being a reflection of necessarily who reports and who doesn't and who gets captured, because there's so many factors that go into reporting and how somebody would actually end up coming here for safety. But living in New York City, being in New York City, being a provider of any kind, the differences between different cultures is tremendous. The perception of what elder abuse is, the perception of law enforcement, the perception of who could they report to, who would actually help. Language is a huge barrier. The kind of perception about where to go. So there's so many different reasons why reporting isn't happening. And race and color and ethnicity and culture all play a role. To me, it's hard to know, to silo those different parts of one's identity out from the person's life experience as a whole. While we pride ourselves that as a shelter, we service all 5 boroughs and Westchester, there are many different kinds and colors of people that we have not seen come through our doors. And why is that? Well, it could be that they don't know about us or the professional they're working with may not know about us, but it might also really be they don't have a professional working with them because there is no conception that there's actually any elder abuse happening or that there's anywhere to go or anybody to tell.
Deirdre didn't have statistics about the racial and ethnic makeup of the Weinberg Center residents, but she did tell me that almost every group and gender is represented. There are more women than men, but not as many more than you would think. Do you think the fact that you're seeing more men is a good thing? Not the sense that they're being abused, because that's not what I'm talking about. The fact that they're making their way to you.
Absolutely. Because we know that men don't necessarily live as long, although everybody's living longer because of gender roles and ideas and identity. I think it's a great thing that we're seeing more men, with the hope that just means more men are reporting, because it's not as if elder abuse is not happening to men.
I've often wondered why people remain silent in the face of abuse, especially that of old people. So I asked about her perspective. You said something earlier about when you are involved in guardianships or when you're doing your daily work, that you do come across people in the community who are aware that something wasn't right in that home, that person was potentially being abused. However, they didn't take that affirmative step to report it. Why is that? I have my theory. What have you seen in your professional work? What are the most common reasons that people give you, if they even give you a reason, as to why they remain silent?
Fortunately, we often don't get to touch the person who's remained silent. We don't know that they're out there. We don't know that they exist, because while we all have neighbors, we don't know. It's not part of any particular protocol to find out what the neighbors know and what they don't. I think people, it's what you said, the nosy neighbors a little bit. A lot of times people don't want to interfere. They don't think it's their job. They don't think it's their responsibility. They're afraid of retribution. They think, oh, that's in their family. There's a helpline actually for neighbors and friends of people who've experienced abuse, because there is a true group of people who have intervened. And, if you see something, ask the questions. If you think something isn't right, then do something about it. And there are people, thankfully, who have stepped in.
I wasn't surprised by what she said next, but it was disappointing for sure.
But not only do we see neighbors not wanting to engage or raise a red flag or sound an alarm, we see that in professionals a lot. Professionals who feel that they're outside the scope of what their job responsibilities are. I used a little bit of the primary care physician example to emphasize how important the role of a primary care physician is for an older adult, and how for in particular, the example that I gave, that woman, where else was she going? The only place she ever went was to the doc. And so that was the only outside touch that she had, because otherwise her daughter otherwise was keeping her isolated. Professionals have a very important role as being a person who can help identify when abuse may be happening. I think we talk about this with lawyers all the time, that lawyers don't think that it's their job. They don't know what they're supposed to do with the information if somebody does report, and people are scared to ask. How did you get that bruise?
Which makes me sad. And that's kind of yet another good segue to my next question. What can the courts do better to meet the needs of older people? Because it wasn't until a couple of years ago that family court started processing cases of elder abuse. And they were permitting organizations like yours and JASA, I can think of so many, to file orders of protection petitions on behalf of an older person.
I have to say, there have been a lot of headway made in the last, 5 years or so even. There's different task forces within the New York State court system now, and there's different courtrooms paying particular attention. They're much more open to the development of programs that would focus on older adults who may have experienced elder abuse.
During this very same conversation, she briefly told me part of a story. An old woman who was in housing court for not paying her rent. She always paid her rent on time. She'd lived in that building for decades. If it wasn't for an eagle-eyed court attorney, the truth may have never come out.
We had a referral for somebody, and it was a court referral. It was fantastic. The court attorney, I think in that case, noticed that an older adult came in with her son, and she saw that the walker she came in with was not the appropriate size walker for her use. She was being evicted when she lived in this apartment her whole life, had paid the rent on time, and suddenly the rent stopped getting paid. What does that tell you?
We then talk about why a second pair of eyes and ears is necessary. The signs are there.
I think having an open mind and understanding that if somebody, an older adult, comes across the court's radar in any way as a person who's being brought in vis-a-vis housing court because they're getting evicted, if that older adult comes in, just make observations and see if something doesn't seem right. When there's a dramatic change in circumstance, that is what triggers somebody being brought into court. Think about the reasons why that changed circumstance might be, and then offer the supportive services. Think about getting somebody eyes and ears into the home. We always say eyes and ears in the home can tell an entire story when an older adult or anybody who's experienced some abuse may not be able to articulate or report or won't or can't. Not being afraid to shy away from the tough questions. Understanding that as a community, we have to all address the public health crisis that is elder abuse. And we all have a responsibility because we're all going to be older if we're not already there. And we do not have laws that require our children to take care of us when we get older, for better or for worse. And so you have to look to your neighbors, and that includes the judicial system. Understanding what the red flags are of elder abuse, knowing the sudden changes, somebody who doesn't look like they are being taken care of or taking care of themselves, somebody who has poor hygiene, somebody who is not appropriately dressed, somebody who doesn't have their dentures, and maybe that's why they're not talking. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that the son is talking or daughter's talking or husband or wife is talking over them. Maybe they don't want to open their mouths because they don't have their dentures in.
Going back to the woman that you were just talking about, was it that the son was stealing her money?
Yes. In that particular case, it was that he moved in and he started taking her money, and her health started to decline. The assistive devices that she needed were either he wasn't getting them for her, or she did not have the income or ability or finances to get it on her own. And over time, he really was the one responsible for putting her in a place of being evicted.
After she was given the support she needed and her health improved, the woman left the Weinberg Center. She was able to return to her home, but her son had to leave. Deirdre couldn't tell me if the woman ever let her son back in. Like she told me, if the person has capacity they can make decisions in their own lives. So what I'm getting is that the Weinberg Center is soup to nuts. So you offer them respite, you offer them shelter, but you're also there to help them reintegrate into the community. What can the Weinberg Center do for someone who has been abused so that they feel safe?
Really appreciate you asking me that, because one of my biggest frustrations is when, particularly this has happened in court, my adversaries have made the argument at times that because we're from a nursing home, we're just seeking to keep the person here and collect their money and house them and store them away, which couldn't be further from the truth. From the onset of the referral, we're thinking about how can this person go back home safely? And if not to their home, to a different home safely. We are not by any stretch looking to keep somebody here when they belong in the community. And quite frankly, you can't work that way.
Where is your model being replicated? Because of the work that I do as an elder law attorney, I've heard of Hebrew Home. I know about the Weinberg Center, but I don't hear about your model anywhere else in New York City or in the state. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but tell me, where's your model being replicated? Not only, well, let's start with here in New York.
So I appreciate that. So our director, Joy Solomon, has started an initiative called the Spring Alliance. So the idea is it's shelters, regional, global, and the Spring Alliance movement is to bring awareness about the model and have it replicated throughout the world. And we've had a lot of success in getting the model replicated. In New York State, I believe we have 2 other models. Certainly in the Northeast area, there's one in New Jersey, and there's one in Pennsylvania, I believe. There's one in Tennessee. And the models can look different because one of the aspects of our model is that we're very legal intensive, for instance. And we also have a rather large staff for the Weinberg Center. I mean, we've got 2 social workers, a public health specialist, and I think it's because we are the first one. But frankly, this model can work in many different kinds of communities and in different scenarios.
Thank goodness you exist. But, as a New Yorker, and just knowing, because I did an interview just the other day with a geriatric social worker who runs a NORC. Because, there's a theme here. I'm very fond of people aging in place. If you haven't noticed already, huge fan. So 3.2 million older people live in New York City alone. And you have to think about how many of those older people are the victims of some type of abuse. And there's only one of you. Literally, there's one Weinberg Center campus for all those potential abuse victims. What I've learned through, my own law practice is that building anything is ridiculously bureaucratic. It's political. It takes a lot of capital. So even if the intention is there, the execution could take years.
I think that's absolutely true, which is why, to be honest with you, this kind of model works because the infrastructure is here. It's already built. And it's a matter of finding the people who can and are willing to support it and take the risk and not say no. It's interesting that the numbers that you bring up, because I think you're absolutely right. There's a tremendous number of people in New York City, and older adults are fastest growing population. How is it that there is only one shelter when you see the statistics on how many people are likely experiencing elder abuse? But have to go back to the number of people who reported. There was a New York State study that was done now a few years ago, but still very relevant and very telling. And what came of that was that in New York State, only 1 of every 24 cases of elder abuse are reported. And it's likely that number is actually even higher because the people who were polled to answer the questions about whether or not they were experiencing abuse were people who could pick up and answer the telephone.
They're very sad and they're very frightening because you said something earlier. We're all getting there. You and I are young. You and I are contemporaries. We're getting there. And it's sort of that saying, today for you, tomorrow for me.
I was speaking to a friend who also happens to work in aging, and it's just, that notion that it's us and versus them, or that there is an us and there is a them, is just totally inaccurate, inappropriately placed. It's not.
What I've learned through my career is that, unfortunately, our most vulnerable fall through the cracks. Even the people you think never could. Those you think are protected from harm. I think older people fall through the cracks. And I can't say whether a person of a lower socioeconomic status falls through the cracks more than somebody who has resources. And I don't know if you remember, and I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name, but a number of years ago, probably 2 to 3 years ago, there was a story in the Daily News and in a lot of the other New York papers about a millionaire who basically died in his home frozen. This was a man who had an enormous amount of money. He founded a company, I believe it was a furniture company. They had turned off his utilities. He had become very hermetic, not really seeing people. And they found him frozen in his apartment in a luxury building. And when I read that story, Deirdre, I'm like, if a man with all that money, with all of those resources, didn't have a person give a damn about him, and excuse the damn, where's the hope for everybody else? Do you know what I mean? How does somebody with all of those resources fall through the cracks? How does somebody not say, I haven't seen so-and-so in a while? So-and-so hasn't left their apartment. So-and-so doesn't want to see people. Why doesn't so-and-so want to see people? Are they depressed? Do they have a mental illness? They let him live in a luxury apartment with no utilities, and he froze in the winter because it was unnecessary. There are all of these, the utility didn't say anything, the bank didn't say anything, the building didn't say anything. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, there were all of these opportunities for somebody to intervene and nothing.
This is exactly the point of what we're saying, right? Is that there are many, many different opportunities for somebody to say something and to ask a question, to ask him, how you doing? Do you need anything? I noticed that you haven't been coming to the door lately. Can I help you do, there are many, many, and 100%, it actually doesn't have to do with financial resources. I mean, you could make one argument that somebody with financial resources is a great target, actually, because they have money to be seized and to be taken. You can make the argument that somebody without resources is a great target, because what are they going to do about it? Resources don't necessarily mean, I think about the Brooke Astor case.
Mm-hmm. That's the most famous of them all.
Yes.
It's one of the most famous of them all.
Yes. And, resources don't necessarily mean it, because resources can't save you from things that happen to your health, or certain things that, aging doesn't stop.
Money doesn't insulate you from bad people or people with ill intentions. It doesn't stop the clock. It doesn't stop your body from breaking down. And even when you have help, like Brooke Astor did, it did nothing to save her from the indignities that she had to go through. She had to live in her own filth. This is Brooke Astor. When I was a kid, I used to open the paper and there's Brooke Astor in the society page, with her fancy dresses. She's living in her own filth.
Yeah, and that was at the hands of a family member, and the person who intervened was also a family member. So she it's and money didn't save her. And maybe you could argue money is what caused that to happen.
Oh yeah, I mean, more money, more problems. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but oftentimes when people have resources, guardianship proceedings are a lot more adversarial, because there are interests involved. There are interests involved that have nothing to do with the human being in question. That's 100%. Not the interest. Yeah.
No. And that is also a very ugly picture of what can be happening, because in guardianship proceedings, the issue is whether or not the person can take care of themselves, and whether or not there's a determination that needs to be made about whether or not the person can take care of themselves. And yet, in the abuse cases that we see, a lot of times, if there is money, there's more lawyers involved, and there's certainly more infighting about who will be responsible, and therefore feel that they're pocketing more money.
With Deirdre's experience working within the elder abuse community, my next set of questions really focused on what the public can do to be of service to others. If you could tell the listener or the listeners, what is one thing that they can do to protect older people?
Ask questions and be a friend. We all know if something doesn't feel right or seem right. If somebody who you've known for a long time looks different suddenly, don't be afraid to ask if they're okay. And don't be afraid to ask if they feel safe. If you don't think that they feel safe, step in. Don't ignore something that's in your face, and lend a really lend a hand to your neighbor. Knock on the door when it's cold out. Make sure your neighbor has heat. And if they don't, why? Why don't they? And if it's an older adult that needs help with something, isolation is the number one, in my opinion, the number one hallmark of elder abuse.
100%. Yep.
So how do you combat that? You don't let an older adult get isolated. Be a friend.
Correct. And for me, that saying, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to take care of your older people. And I always say, be the nosy neighbor. The worst thing that can happen is you're that nosy lady next door who asks too many questions. I'd rather be known as the nosy lady than to be the neighbor that had a gut feeling. And I listen to my gut a lot because I've been in situations where I didn't, and that had consequences. So your gut tells you something for a reason. So I think that if something doesn't feel right, it's because you have a sixth sense telling you that something is off. Maybe you're off, maybe you're not, but I would much rather run the risk of being that nosy neighbor than not asking the question and having regret. And you're correct. You said something earlier about people just don't like getting involved. They don't think it's any of their business. Do we have an affirmative duty to step in to save somebody? Remember law school? We don't. Unless we're physicians, we don't have an affirmative duty. If I see somebody drowning, I could easily wave at them and keep driving. Do you know what I mean? It sounds heartless, but people have done that. They've actually watched people drown. But at the same time, personally for me, because of the area of law that you and I both work in, I feel like there's an ethical and a moral duty that we have as one human being to another to extend that hand, to be that nosy neighbor.
Absolutely. And don't, for professionals, don't stay inside your bubble. Spend that extra 5 minutes, ask the question. And, to every person who in your personal life, forget your professional identity, absolutely ask the questions. By asking somebody, how did you get that bruise on your eye? Do we think if it's somebody, our neighbor, that they'll necessarily tell us? Well, it'll depend, I suppose, on your relationship with your neighbor. And if you don't have much of a relationship, do you think you're really going to get an honest answer that, no, the person I'm living with punched me in the face? No, you may not. But you will be able to tell in part by the response somebody gives you whether or not you think what they're saying is true or not. And what does that tell you? That maybe something else is going on. And that if not at that moment, maybe your neighbor knows that you kind of know something, and that neighbor can come back to you and knock on your door, and you can be a safe place for them.
You're opening the door for them to know that you're a safe haven.
Right, literally and figuratively.
And figuratively, absolutely. Speaking of safe havens, what has working in elder abuse all of these years taught you?
That one person can make a difference. But what I would say differentiates most of the people who come to the Hebrew home for long-term care versus somebody who's entering into our shelter, if I had to articulate one difference, it would be that the people who come into long-term care have support. They have either family or loved ones. For most of the Weinberg clients and residents who come into shelter, they don't have anybody, likely because of their abuser or because of the circumstances the abuser them in. So many of the people here who've come through our doors have looked to us as really their family. I didn't realize my own sense of impact that I could have on another person's life. And I realize that now. And I don't mean in terms of my lawyering or even in my role here, so much as I mean knowing that I can approach a person who I don't know whether or not they have anybody else, but in these instances haven't had other people, and I can talk to them, and that moment for them is everything. I can have meaning for another person simply by being a friendly, warm person to them. I mean, that has taught me about my own self-importance, frankly, and what the power of being kind to somebody.
It's about extending humanity and extending kindness and compassion to another human being. And even if it's just for a few minutes, you have no clue how that small act of kindness, that may be something that you're not actively thinking about, it's just something that you naturally do, can impact another human's life. Because there are people who suffer in this world who've never had the benefit of human kindness, or who have been subjected to cruelty. And I think it's important that when you can be kind to somebody, you do so, not expecting anything in return. You have to be kind for kindness' sake, because it's the right thing to do. And that's what I like about the type of law that we do. Like, obviously you deal more with the elder abuse, but I think that we all ultimately end up in the areas of law, or doing the things that we are meant to do, the things that we are called to, and the things that we have aptitude for, and also a vocation. I think that to be a lawyer in this area of law, in these related areas of law, you have to have a vocation. If you don't like people, don't do this work. If you're not empathetic, please don't do this work. If you don't care about people and you only care about yourself, please stay away.
Well, it's certainly not the area to go in if you are interested in income. If that's your top, you have to be interested in people for sure and enjoy people.
I may be biased, but I get up every day liking what I do, helping people. To end the interview, I asked Deirdre what she thought a person needed in order to work with older people. Her answer really resonated with me. Our work may be challenging, but there's something that keeps us coming back. One parting note or one parting question. What would you tell somebody, and this wasn't even a planned question, but what would you tell somebody who's interested in pursuing this area as their area of law? Or even if they're not lawyers, if they're interested in working with older people, and particularly those who have been abused, what do you think is necessary in order for them to do the job the right way?
Oh my gosh, if you're interested in it, do it. The more people that we can have around us who are paying attention to aging issues, the better. And there's so many different areas you can explore. It's fascinating. It's wonderful and fulfilling and fascinating and challenging. And yeah, I'm clearly very fulfilled in working with older adults. If there's one thing I could say to people who are interested in what is it that they need to learn, or what is it that they need to possess to enter into the field, a love for older adults. For me, you learn what you need to in law school, you get specific trainings, you develop certain skills, but what guides you at the end of the day, for me at least, is my drive to advocate for the person or people that I'm trying to assist. And it's what drives you and gets me up every day and gets me wanting to come to work and continue to think about how to make the world better for aging people. And I think that has to be what sustains somebody who wants to enter into this field.
As always, I want to thank my guest, Deirdre Lok, for her time and her dedication to a community we both value. Advocating for those who have lost their voice and ability to defend themselves, giving them back their dignity, is hard work, but it is truly work that changes lives. To learn more about the Weinberg Center for Elder Justice, please go to www.theweinbergcenter.org. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Aging Wisely, the podcast. As I do at the end of every episode, I want to thank Adam Gelchis and his family band, The Waffles, for my theme music, and Sonorous Lab for their sound design and engineering. If you like my podcast, please subscribe or follow. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora, SoundCloud, or if you spend any time on YouTube, the podcast has a channel by the same name where you can find the episodes and listen. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, you can go to agingwiselypodcast.com and look around. Listen to this and prior episodes. Even better, subscribe to my newsletter. Every 2 weeks, the current episodes and the transcript to the current episode straight into your inbox. If you know of a person or an organization that's a good fit for my podcast, go to my website and drop me a note. I would love to meet them. And if you like this episode, I would love a review on whatever platform you listen. And if you enjoy the podcast or have benefited from it in any way, please let others know about it. I would appreciate it. Join me for another episode in 2 weeks. Bye.